So a reflection on intentions and habits. I showed up at the swimming pool for the first time in the new year this week on my usual day at my usual dark 30 time, and it was uncommonly packed. I was nonplussed for a second, and then it hit me. Oh yeah, New Year's resolutions. January is always like this at the pool, and so is September for some reason. Maybe there's something almost as innate in beginnings associated with the new school year as with the new calendar year. At any rate, after a few weeks, it always levels off and I'm back to a swim lane by myself. I've never really been one for New Year's resolutions. I get it that the new year is a time of new beginnings, and it feels like a clean slate. Lately, either due to the pandemic or because I'm of a certain age, I find myself more often thinking, dang, we really have to start over again? I don't think I have the energy for another 363 days of this. But I have set out over the years to make changes in my life's habits that were hard. A number of years ago, having worked for too long on climate change, and before that on reforming the agriculture system, I'd just seen too much of the horrors of the meat industry. I finally decided to buck my deeply ingrained Midwest steak and potatoes heritage and give up red meat. The rest of my family, they had no interest in this endeavor, so there I'd be smelling bacon on the stove in the morning or burgers on the grill at night. It was hard for a while, but became easier over time, and especially because of this, I started to notice that I was feeling better. And I think unexpected side benefits certainly help with resolve to stick to some new hard plan. And so too is some flexibility. I've now modified my no red meat policy a bit. I won't order it or buy it, but if presented to me, I'll eat it. I have another dad friend of mine of this same persuasion. He fully admits he roots for his two kids to overfill their plates with his forbidden goodies so that he'll have an excuse to eat the leftovers later on when he's cleaning up in the kitchen. I like this. Rationalizations and justifications seem just fine to me if you're trying to stick with the spirit of these types of personal resolutions. But what about more broadly in life? Like, why don't I more fully live our UU values? I came across a book once at an old job when we were engaged in yet another cycle of executive team leadership development. It's called Immunity to Change. In it, Robert Keegan and Lisa Lasko-Leahy say that we don't succeed at important adaptive challenges in our lives, not because of bad plans or poor intention. Our inability to change, they say, is because of deep-rooted assumptions and conflicting commitments we hold dearly, and that these may be so entrenched that they're unconscious. There are truths so fundamental in our lives, in my life, that I simply don't recognize that I hold them, and thus I don't see when a new commitment I make or undertake with all good intention might threaten these other immutable truths. This resonates with me. So hang on for a minute while I spin out an example. In the winter before the Declaration of Independence was written and signed, Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense. It was a crucial moment in the course of the revolution. Would there be broad enough public support for what came to pass in Philadelphia that coming summer or not? In the section he titled Thoughts on the Present State of American Affairs, Paine put it in stark terms where he thought the greatest concern lay with building that necessary public support. Though I would carefully avoid giving unnecessary offense, he wrote, yet I'm inclined to believe that all those who espouse the doctrine of reconciliation with England may be included within the following descriptions: financially interested men who are not to be trusted, weak men who cannot see, prejudiced men who will not see, and a certain set of moderate men who think better of the European world than it deserves, and this last class, by an ill-judged deliberation, will be the cause of more calamities to this continent than all of the other three. So who are these moderate men that were a bigger threat to independence than the prejudiced or the solely self-interested? Paine describes them. It is the good fortune of many, he wrote, to live distant from the scene of sorrow. The evil is not sufficiently brought to their doors to make them feel the precariousness with which all American property is possessed. Moderate men, Paine believed, were worse for the necessary steps for independence than all these others combined. So skipping ahead 200 years, it's 1963, and Martin Luther King Jr. is in a jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama, having been arrested for leading nonviolent protests for economic justice. Writing longhand, he penned his letter from a Birmingham jail. At a moment like Paine's in 1775, 1963 was a pivotal time for the civil rights movement, and King stepped back to assess. I must confess, he wrote, that over the last few years I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. Shallow understanding, King wrote, from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. So there it is again. The moderate of latent goodwill is a greater threat to freedom than the prejudiced, the self-centered, and the active oppressor. We are now at another inflection point in the American experiment. When analysts looked at the folks who showed up at the Capitol last January 6th, the only thing those participants shared, not age, not education, not income, not geography, the only thing they shared was that they came from counties in the United States undergoing the fastest demographic change. The Dominionists, who look like me, privileged white men, feel perhaps most deeply for the first time threatened by cultural changes, threatened by economic changes, and most definitely threatened by demographic changes. And they are willing increasingly to break our democracy rather than live within it. So where does that leave me? In this moment, am I doing all I can to live into our 7 principles? And particularly our 2nd principle of justice, equity, and compassion, and our 5th of fully engaging and supporting the democratic process? Because I am also that moderate of latent goodwill, the man both Paine and King believed most threatening to freedom and justice, because I hold another value more deeply, that of comfort and order, and most importantly, the privilege to look the other way. I don't know if or how I am doing enough, but I do believe I must at least be honest with myself and look at my hidden 8th principle without sugarcoating it. Only then can I start to chip away at my own immunity to change.
I'd like to open this sermon with a prayer by an unknown author. Dear Lord, so far I've done all right. I haven't gossiped, haven't lost my temper, haven't been greedy, grumpy, nasty, selfish, or overindulgent. I'm really glad about that. But in a few minutes, God, I'm going to get out of bed. And from then on, I'm going to need a lot more help. Yeah, when I wake up in the morning, I start off with really, really good intentions of how I'm going to be that day. And then, I go make my coffee, my habitual ritual in the morning, and the coffee overflows, and I drop a cup and it breaks, and just things start going downhill, and you just know this is not going to be a good day. I'm going to need a lot more help. And of course, at the start of the new year, it's the same thing. You start with this idea of, New Year resolutions. And New Year resolutions have become a bit of a punchline, because it's just a question of how long are they going to last? Is it going to be minutes, hours, days? In a really good year, it might be weeks. But, it has become a punchline. And I think that's a little bit of a shame, because I think New Year resolutions tap into a very profound human yearning, that yearning of maybe wanting to change, that to have a life more meaningful, to take up a hobby, to have better relationships with family and friends. New Year resolutions do tap into a yearning that I think many of us have, of an intention of how we'd like to do better and have a more meaningful life. And then I think there's another darker side to New Year resolutions, that when we fail again, it's like, oh, failed again, just like last year. And it starts to kind of trigger that disappointment in ourselves and, a sense of inadequacy and perhaps even a sense of shame. Perhaps even a sense of shame that I'm not capable of doing this. And I think our Unitarian tradition, the Unitarian side of a Unitarian Universalist tradition, can be quite dangerous there, because we put a lot of focus, especially in the 19th century, on character, on human development. And we've often been accused of salvation by character as the basic tenet of our Unitarian movement. I think New Year resolutions do tap into that. We do want to change. I think it's a human instinct. We do want to do better this year than we did last year. We want to do better next year than we did this year. Why is living into our intentions so difficult? A wise person once said that your habits will eat your good intentions for lunch. Your habits will eat your good intentions for lunch. I find that really interesting, because we have these habits. We are creatures of habit. It's estimated by scientists who research this type of thing, 40 to 45% of our day, we are just living out of our habits, not fully conscious of what we're doing. And that can seem a little bit surprising, but think when you're in the car and you're driving. We've developed so many habits around driving that we can listen to the radio, often deep conversations. We can be in deep conversations with those in the car with us. And then we get to the place that we ended up and we're like, whoa, we're here. How did I get here? On the flip side of that is you're on the road where you go to your usual work or home, and you're actually going somewhere else, but you end up back at work or home, and your destination was supposed to be elsewhere because we were just acting out of our habits. So I think it's really worth looking at this relationship, and that's what I wanted to do today, is that relationship between our intentions and our habits. And I love that song that the choir sang, "The Water is Wide," because I think sometimes the gap between our intentions and our habits can be very wide. And I want to just find a way of maybe we can just bring that gap a little bit closer through some spiritual practice. Indian American author Deepak Chopra says, conscious change is brought about by two qualities inherent in our consciousness: intention and attention. Intention and attention. Whatever you put attention to will grow stronger in your life. Whatever takes your attention away from, whatever you take your attention away from will wither, disintegrate, and disappear. So what we put our intention to will grow. What we don't take our attention away from will wither. That's a really profound idea. So that's saying that for all we do with our intentions, unless we pay attention to them, they will wither. I think it's interesting to think of New Year resolutions because it is the month of January, and most of you know that January is named after the Roman god Janus. And Janus is the two-faced god, one looking forward in time and one looking back in time. And of course, it's very common in Unitarian Universalist congregations to start the new year with the burning bowl, or fire communion, which is a term I like, where we often burn something we'd like to leave behind from last year. And I can imagine there's a lot of things we'd like to leave behind from last year. COVID pandemic being one of them, racism being another, anti-democratic behavior that was symbolized in January 6th last year. But I actually want to think about looking forward more this year, because I think it's important. We know that this year feels like the third year of 2020. We're entering into the 2-year anniversary of the pandemic, and we'll be going into a third year. We recognize that. And we're fed up with that. But what is going to help us move through this? Because I heard Chris talking about how he's just frustrated. He can't imagine another 363 days of this again. And I hear that. So I want to really explore what might help us, what intention can we set that might help us through this year. One of my goals every day, every week, every month, every year, it's not a very grand goal. I did a lot of thinking about this when I was in seminary, and it's a goal I came up with. And my goal is I want to make brand new mistakes. That's my goal. It's like, and I have to say, I'm getting really good at it. I make plenty of mistakes, not all of them brand new. I think a lot of us have learned with the technology of Zoom that we're all pretty good at mistakes, and I would like to not make that I'm muted when trying to speak mistake. I keep repeating that one, so I'm not learning that one. But the idea of brand new mistakes is that I want to be pushing myself, to be doing new things, to be trying new things, to be trying to grow, to try and improve. So I want to be pushing myself to be more creative, to try new things. I also want to learn from my history. I want to look at other people's experience. I want to learn from other people's experience. I want to learn from my own experience. So I try and repeat as few mistakes as possible. So I think actually making brand new mistakes is a lot more meaningful goal than it may sound at first pass. The great Unitarian Universalist religious educator Angus MacLean said, "We are not merely the bellhops of history, passing the baggage of one generation to another. Yet culture makes it possible for human relations to bridge the grave. For individuals who are so short of days to live with a wisdom derived from the dawn of time, our job, however, is not to worship history and culture like fetishes, but to feed them into a living creative stream of personal life for spiritual and intellectual processing. Our job is not to worship history and culture like fetishes, but to feed them into a living creative stream of personal life for spiritual and intellectual processing." And I love that. Yet we do look at the past, but not looking at the past just about our regrets and our mistakes, but what can we learn from them and how can we bring that into our present to guide our path forward in the future? And if I do reflect in the past, like this past year, I have to say I experienced disappointment, anger, confusion, and a sense of hopelessness. What is happening in our world? What is happening to our democracy? The January 6th, we call it insurrection or the assault on our democracy. I really believe that there's too many people in our country who don't value democracy, and some of them are elected officials. You can have your partisan politics, and I've got my own partisan politics as much as anyone, but first and foremost, as our principles call us to, is belief in the use of the democratic process, both in our congregations and in the wider world. And I value that more than any partisan politics, because I don't necessarily believe I always vote the right way. You probably do. I'm not sure I always have. So that assault on our democracy really requires our actions. And I loved what Chris was talking about how, sometimes we value our own comfort. Would I have assaulted, if I believed the election was overthrown, would I have conduct an insurrection? Would I have gone to the Capitol? If I really believed that our democracy was threatened and overthrown? I'm not saying those people were right that did it. I think the election was fair. But if I really believe, would I do that? And I'm not sure I do. And I think it's a little bit like what Chris was saying about my own comfort. That's just going too far. So how much am I willing to go? What are my intentions in preserving democracy? Because I really strongly believe it is under threat. And I really value our Social Action Council and this community because they've put voting rights and the democratic process as one of our key justice issues. Thank you for that, and I'm committed to work with you in ensuring that in the future. I mentioned disappointment, anger, confusion, and hopelessness. So what do these emotions that come up when I look at the past mean to me? Now, my disappointment, confusion can help me be empathetic. I think many of us probably experience that with our current situation, and so that can help with my empathy. And anger is an energy and can call me into action. And I think it can do. I don't think my hopelessness serves me well. What good does my hopelessness do for me and for those around me? Unitarian Universalists pride ourselves in being a heretical religion, and heresy means to choose. We choose what values we want to focus on, we choose what we believe, and we choose our religious faith, and we choose to live intentionally when we're at our best. Intentional living is making our own choice before the universe or other people make choices for us. And it's more about heading in a direction rather than having a concrete goal. What direction do we want our life to go in? Because we can't really control where we end up with our goals, but what directions do we want to be moving in? American author and educator Donna Makova says, when you have the courage to shape your life from the essence of who you are, you ignite becoming truly alive. This requires letting go of everything that is inauthentic. But how can you ever know your truth unless you slow down in your own quiet company? When the inner walls to your soul are gratified with advertisements, commercials, and the opinions of everyone who has ever known and labeled you, turning inward requires nothing less than a major cleanup. Continuing on with Donna's words, traveling from the known to the unknown requires crossing an abyss of emptiness. We first experience disorientation and confusion. Then, if we are willing to cross the abyss in curious and playful wonder, we enter an expansive, untamed country that has its own rhythm. Time melts and thoughts become stories, music, poems, images, ideals. This is the intelligence of the heart. But by that, I don't mean just the seat of emotions. I mean a vast range of receptive and connective abilities, intuition, innovation, wisdom, creativity, sensitivity, the aesthetic, qualitative, and the meaning-making. It is here we uncover our purpose and passion. Those are the words of Donna Makova. So I'm going to invite you to explore an idea. We're not doing the burning bowl where we write a word in and let it go from last year. I want you to think about an intentional word that will guide you for this year. A word that may help you when you're struggling or feeling dejected. Or maybe it will help you move in the direction of a change you seek. It may be a word that comforts you in grief, comforts you in uncertainty, helps you overcome fear. Take some time now, right now, to reflect on what intention you wish to set your primary attitude for as you move forward into 2022. And this is not a goal you want to achieve, but an attitude you would like to adopt as a spiritual practice. One word. And I'm going to invite you to enter it into a Menti, and we'll see a word cloud later in the service of this. I'm going to type in a link into the chat for those of you who can get it, and it's on the screen. So for those of you who have internet access and can connect to that, go in and you'll see there's 3 opportunities to list a word. That's just for any families who would like to do it or couples. So if you could enter one word of an intention that you would like to guide you, what one word do you want to use to set your intentions for 2022? So I invite you to do that now, and we'll come back to a word cloud later. Because we all do have some influence in the direction and attitude we take into our future. And I want to say, if you can't access that, you're welcome to be able to type it into the chat as well. And I will enter it into the Menti thing later, and I'll send out the word cloud to everyone by email this week. We all do have some influence in the direction and attitude that we take into the future. We can choose that as Unitarian Universalists. So I asked myself, the word I came up with is hopeful. Can I be authentically hopeful as I move into the future? As I said, that experience of hopelessness does not do me or anyone else any good. If I get stuck there, I have to acknowledge it's a real emotion. So I need to develop some spiritual practices to help me be more hopeful. And for intentions to be successful, and this is why resolutions really kind of fail, is you need a plan to make them habits. Now, they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and that may be true. I would also hope the road to heaven is paved with good intentions as well. And I think what can make those intentions meaningful and transformative for us, if we can make them habits for us, and we can basically put them through what's called a habit loop process. Because habits are these automated behaviors in some contexts which run kind of out of our unconscious mind, be it driving, be it riding a bicycle. Perhaps when some of us are cooking, we're so ingrained with stirring or chopping or various kitchen aspects. They've become habitual to us and they become easy. We don't need to make a conscious choice to do it. But new habits, I think this is a confusion. It's not just about willpower or a bold statement of resolution, but we need a process. And there's a 3-part process that these people who research this type of thing say that we need to adopt. We need a cue or trigger that tells the brain to go into automatic mode. We need the routine behavior itself. And we need a reward. Because without the reward, then there's no motivations to do it. Because what happens, the dopamine that we get as a reward when something good happens, helps with the neural connections in our mind to strengthen them. So we do need a reward. And some of the things we want to do, like, we often say with New Year resolutions, losing weight, starting a new hobby, learning a musical instrument, eating healthier, the gratification's delayed. So we don't get that dopamine hit. So we need to give our short-term rewards for these things that have long-term gratifications. And that's why it's often so difficult to sustain. And the other thing I say with developing new habits is to stack your habits. So if you're trying to develop a new habit, build it on an existing habit. Like I mentioned, I like to have a cup of coffee in the morning and the afternoon and often the evening. But if you have coffee, maybe if that's part of your habit, build another habit on there. Like maybe if you want to go for a walk before your coffee, or go for a walk after your coffee, but build it on top of another habit can help sustain it. I had a friend who wanted to exercise, and so the goal was to do one sit-up. The goal was just to do one sit-up. And so he'd get on his clothes and stuff like that, and his shoes, and he'd get on the floor and he'd do one sit-up. And when he's gone to all that effort, he realized, I may as well do more. So really picking a small goal can be easier to start rather than, I'm going to go to the gym for an hour. And you go to the gym for an hour and the next day you wake up and you can't move. And when you're driving, you're lifting your leg from the accelerator to the brake and things like that. Maybe you go to the gym for 5 minutes. Maybe you just go for a walk. Maybe you do one sit-up. Start gently, whatever you're going to do. So I was thinking about, how am I going to do that about hope? How can I be more hopeful? So I thought, well, I usually wake up in the morning, and after I get my coffee, I say to my Google Home, I say, tell me the latest news on NPR, because everyone knows NPR is just the radio wing of the Unitarian Universalist movement. And I always listen to the news. Now, you probably noticed that the news is not the most hopeful source of information these days. So I decided yesterday, I'm going to test Google. I said, tell me something hopeful. My first response from Google about tell me something hopeful was, did you know that 17th century English women would go to sleep with bay leaves under their pillow so they would dream about their future husbands? That might be hopeful for 17th century English women, but it really didn't do me much good in this. So I thought, I'll try it again. Tell me something else hopeful. And said, do you know that The first use of a barcode was in Wrigley's chewing gum. Well, that might be hopeful for Wrigley's, but it didn't do me any good. So I'm going to find another way. So what I'm going to do is like find poetry that's hopeful, find readings that are hopeful. And when I'm doing my coffee, I'm not going to be listening to the news. I'm going to find some sources of hope that I can embrace. And I don't think it's going to be Google. So that's what I invite you to do, like how to build a habit. Like whatever word that you put into the cloud, what I would invite you to do is, how can you build a habit to remind you of that during the course of the day? Because that's what is going to sustain it and make it habitual. And remember to reward yourself when you do it. How do you reward yourself? That is your choice. What's meaningful to you? Maybe you give yourself time off. Maybe you have your favorite piece of chocolate, your cake, or whatever. Maybe you have 2 cups of coffee. I don't know, but you make sure you reward yourself, because the brain does not distinguish between good and bad behavior. The brain just develops along repeated behavior. And one of my friends always used to correct me when people would say, oh, practice makes perfect, and said, no, practice makes permanent. It does not make perfection. Practice makes permanent. And repetition helps the brain build stronger neurons in that, so it's easier to repeat things because you do not have to make this conscious effort to do it. So the other thing I want to really explore with you right now, and it's something I've been wanting to bring into the UUFRC community, is what would it mean for every one of us to have a spiritual growth plan? Intentional about how we want to grow spiritually, what concerns we want to focus on, and what areas we wish to commit our life and spare time to. What seeds of growth do you want to plant within yourself and cultivate? And I want you to think, go back to the word that you set with your intention. What spiritual practices would you like to have there, and what plan do you have? Because really, to turn mass intention into mass action, you need to have a plan. And then you need to leverage positive peer pressure. So I'd love to, within this community, we can do it in small groups, we can do it in partner buddies. We can do it in just accountability partners, like you have to check in with someone to say, have you been following up with your plan? That can encourage us to change that intention into action. Because ultimately, all of those are going to reinforce our identity. As I said earlier, delayed gratification is hard, and we need to be accountable to keep following through with it. And our accountability partners in this community can help remind us that you're doing it, rewarding you when you do it. Doing something particularly difficult is a lot easier with a friend or a partner, and that's why collaboration is so important. It's a lot easier to have co-chairs of a committee than a single chair, because you can work together, split the task, and it's just more connection, and ultimately connection is what religious community is about. To change long-term behavior, we need to find ways to reward ourselves, and do it without guilt and without shame. Reward ourselves for following up on our intentions and making them habits. Because goal-driven behavior is problematic because it's so far down the line. If you miss the goal, then it just can feel dejecting and you just want to give up. Because the action we take informs who we are. In many ways, we're defined by the actions we take, our identity. Every action we take is a vote for who we want to become. Because true change is identity change. And ultimately, I believe religious communities, we want to grow our spiritual selves. We want to develop a religious, spiritual, Unitarian, Universalist identity. And I'll give you an example. The goal is not really to read a book. The goal is to become a reader. It's not to run a marathon, but become a runner. It's not to write a book, but become a writer. Not to vote, but become a voter. Because all the first are one-off things. We want to change our identity to become those things. We want to be voters, not just going out to vote in an election. And being a voter, you want to open it up to other people to vote. and support the democratic process. And from a religious perspective, it's not about believing in God, but to lead a spiritual life lived by our values. Not to forgive some specific person, but nurture our capacity to forgive. Not to have hope for a specific outcome, but to cultivate hopefulness in ourselves and others in all circumstances. So I want to go back and look at our word cloud right now. You should be able to see that. Some of us are a bit small. Thank you for all of you who responded. That means a lot of people responded. And you can see that the words that are larger, more people requested those. Gratitude, compassion, try, love, joy, mindfulness. And I will add words that people typed into the chat, and I will add it and I'll send it out to everyone so you can see this. Because these are intentions we all express as words to guide us for this year, and that's a really, really powerful idea. So think about your word, and you might look at this and see words that are more interesting from other people, and that's okay. This is not a right or wrong exercise. But you can see the hopes that we have, these resolutions, and these are not about goals, these are about how we want to, intentions we want to set for ourselves, but how we want to live. Because ultimately, I believe our religious community should help us identify values most important to each of us, support us in living into those, our best intentions, and making these intentions healthy habits in our life. Ours is a lived religion about deeds, not creeds, actions, not beliefs, and love, not fear. And I want to finish with a poem by Donna Makova. I will not die an unlived life. I will not die an unlived life. I will not live in fear of falling or catching fire. I choose to inhabit my days, to allow my living to open me, to make me less afraid, more accessible, to loosen my heart until it becomes a wing, a torch, a promise. I choose to risk my significance, to live so that that which came to me as seed goes to the next as blossom, and that which came to me as blossom goes on as fruit. Those are the words of Donna Makova. Blessed be, and amen.